showed me what instead of asking why. Start asking why not. Time flies when you're having fun. Time flies when you're lying in the sun. Bit by bit, the older that we get, the faster it tick, 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 ticks. Time flies. Whoa, whoa, time flies.
Time flies. Thank you, Dennis Beck, for that great song. Today is going to be a little bit different. I've been thinking about this for a while, and so first of all, sorry we're late. We had some technical issues. Fortunately, Logan, our producer, is over here and he got it worked out. But the reason we have technical issues is because I have a guest. I have a guest on. You won't see him, but you'll hear him. My brother Barth is on the phone. Barth, welcome.
Thank you. You must be desperate to call me.
Well, I figured that you might have a pretty good idea of contributions to this podcast more than anyone else. And so I knew I couldn't get Brother Mike on. So I'm glad that you joined me today. Again, we're going to honor Don and Lois, our folks, today. We're going to document some history, and it means a lot to us, the family, hopefully the kids, the grandkids. And down the road, some of the stories that we're going to share today will be in the cloud for future generations. So that's what we're doing. I think there'll be some fun stories, some interesting things for others as well. There'll be a lot of other people that have been in our lives through mom and dad that maybe will be listening, and we'll be able to share also as we reminisce. I wanted to just briefly mention we've had a great week here at the community center. The Cherry Blossom Festival has been in force this week, and we have several of the events here in the gymnasium and in the facility, and we are appreciative of that. It helps us pay the bills when we can rent out some of our space, and they've been good partners this week for us, and we appreciate that. Lots of celebrities and child actors and so forth are down in the gym right now as we speak. So we are honored to be a part of that. I thought what we would do is kind of start with mom and dad and their raising, who they belong to, families, and we'll move into the married life and then the raising of the three boys, Mike, Barth, and myself, and then into their latter years as we go along. So again, we'll try to throw some stories in as we go, and we may get a little off script, which we really don't have a script. We may reminisce as we go, and we may be a little bit out of order from time to time, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to share some things that we'll be able to keep forever. So Don Fraker, Donald William Fraker, Ada Lois Roast. Many may not have known that Mama's first name was Ada. And Barth, she was named after a woman. Do you remember who that was?
I do not remember.
There was some older friend that Grandma Roast knew, an older lady who had the name Ada, and that is who she supposed. It wasn't family, but Grandma Josie liked that name and named Mom Ada. I don't know that Mom was as fond of Ada as she was Lois, and for whatever reason, maybe it wasn't as popular in those days in the 30s, so she always went by Lois. But I think Ada is a beautiful name, and I've heard younger mothers today name their young girls Ada. So Dad was born in 1930. He was born to Fred and Irene Thomas Fraker. Fred Fraker was one of 6 Frakers, I guess you might say, children of William B. and Laura Fraker, who moved to Webster County around the turn of the century, somewhere around 1900. Maybe 1902 or 3. Fred was actually born in '02, and I believe he was born in Dallas County, but the way I understand, they moved over here and then moved back for a short time to Buffalo, and that's where Fred was born, and then they came back to Marshfield for good. Laura was an Anderson, and she was also from that Red Top community, but in later years, much of her family obviously ended up here as well. Siblings, brothers and sisters, and of course the a lot of the Andersons that we all knew growing up in Marshfield in the 40s and 50s and 60s were of the same family, including Jerry Anderson, the formidable basketball star for MSU, SMS at the time. He's a cousin to my dad. So Don, let's go back to Fred for a minute. So Fred, had brothers Estrel, Roy and Glenn, and he had a little brother that died. His name was Frankie, and he's buried in the cemetery over in Buffalo in Dallas County, actually south of Buffalo. It's the Fraker Cemetery, and it's in the Red Top Foose area. I've been there. It's a nice cemetery, well kept, and still somewhat of an active cemetery. Pretty nice sized cemetery. The Frakers were kin to the Stricklands, the Cooksies, the Agees. Those are some old families over there. Gary Strickland, who was the Walmart manager here, and Roberta, who still lives in Marshfield, good friends of our family. They're distant relatives that way up the line somewhere. Also Derek Strickland, who works for Roast Ready Mix, where I work now part-time, and Derek is part of that same family. So there's connections back there. Fred or Estrel and Laura moved, as I said, Webster County. He was a freighter. He had a team of horses, and he hauled freight from Dallas County to Webster County, or basically Buffalo to Marshfield to Springfield. Kind of made that triangle. And then he was partners in a livery stable around the turn of the century with. Okay, Barth, I'm drawing a blank. Uncle Will.
Thomas?
No. On
Willie
the other
B?
side. No, that's Grandma's dad. Uncle Will Young, Lawrence Young's father, was the brother-in-law to Will Fraker, who he was a partner with in the livery stable. And that livery stable is located somewhere in the area of Marshfield Machinery, in that area. Again, around the turn of the century. The way I understand it, Will Young manned the fort, you might say, stayed at the livery stable, and Will Fraker ran the team and delivered the freight around those three points. So they all grew up obviously in the Marshfield area and stayed in the Marshfield area. And then I forgot to mention, those were the brothers, and then Norma Thomas was their only sister. Aunt Norma Thomas, who was Noel Thomas and Melva June Owen's mother. She married Lee Thomas, William Lee Thomas. Now there's a double connection there, because our grandmother, Irene Thomas, Fred's wife, was a sister to William Lee Thomas. And there were some other children there as well. Gardner Thomas, Virgil Thomas, Aunt Elsie Thomas, and Aunt Maisie Thomas were all her brothers and sisters, and Lee Thomas's brothers and sisters. So thus, my dad, who had one brother, Gene, who became the sheriff, Eugene, only the two boys, they were double first cousins to Noel Thomas and Melva June Owen, because they had the same bloodline, the same amount of blood connection, you might say, with both parents being married to brothers and sisters.
Brother sister married brother sister.
There you go. Yeah, it wasn't in Arkansas.
And I was always told it's legal.
Yes, it is that way. It is that way. So Irene and Fred then got married in 1921, and they all were raised kind of out in the Mission Home area, Mission Home community. And I have something that I want to show that's very valuable to us. My dad kept this for a long time in his basement, in his man cave where he had stuff. This is a piece of siding off of the house that Fred was raised in or lived part of his youth in when he was in high school, I guess. It was out on the Don Kruger farm, which is Pleasant Prairie Drive, goes out and you make the 90-degree bend out there where the Rainies are at, and then now I think the Messick's are in that area. Well, Don Kruger was the next place on the left, and he tore this old house down when he built his house in the 70s. And this piece of siding was on the back porch. Back in those days, the old back porches didn't have insulation or maybe anything on the inside. They just had the siding on the outside. And on this piece of siding, if I'll try to hold it up here, was in pencil, Fred Fraker plus or and the and sign, Irene Thomas. Fred Fraker and Irene Thomas. What this tells us was he did this when they were dating. They got married in 1921, so sometime 1919, 1920, 1921 before they got married, he was in love with her, and he wrote her name on the inside of the back porch. So when Krugers tore that house down, Don Kruger cut this piece off and brought it into my dad, who worked at the bank, and said, "I've got something I think you would like to have." And so, obviously, yes, Dad accepted that and had it in his downstairs room all these years. So it's kind of a neat piece of nostalgia for us. Fred and Irene then raised the boys, Gene and Don, on the farm. They eventually ended up on the farm that became what we all kind of knew as the Glen Fraker Dairy Farm there on the corner of 38 and J Highway. My grandpa actually built that big barn, and he had built a grade A barn there, a dairy barn, and lived in the house that's still there, I believe Tom Hayes owns today. And that's where Dad and Gene both were when they graduated from high school in the 40s. 44 for Gene, 48 for Dad. Dad would always talk about Grandpa giving them a dollar bill, and they would go to town in the morning in the summertime when they weren't in school, obviously. And that dollar bill would buy them 5 gallons of gas for the tractors, and also give them both enough to buy a bottle of pop and a candy bar each, and they had about a nickel left. So that kind of tells you what the price of things were in the mid 40s. But they had a great time being raised on that farm. There also was a tomato canning factory that was around the corner there off 38, kind of behind, right in there where Phil Kittrell's house it was at. And my grandpa owned that canning factory. This would have been in the 30s, of course, when Dad was a younger boy. And I know Elwood Cooley, the Cooleys lived there and helped at the factory, and Dad and Elwood were about the same age and worked together, on the farm and canned tomatoes like many families did in those Depression days. My grandpa was a builder. He had a building company called Fraker Price Construction, and he was a partner with Lawrence Price. Lawrence Price was an uncle to Rex Price, Gary Price, Jerry, Perry, all those Price boys. And they lived out at Beach. We had Gary Price on earlier this year and talked about growing up in Beach. And so anyway, they had this company together, and this was in the 30s. This was when the Depression was going on. There were a lot of, WPA projects going on around. A lot of county bridges were built in those days, low water bridges, concrete bridges, and so forth. And so in order to get work back then, if the county commission leaned Republican, in other words, if 2 out of the 3 county commissioners that would get elected would be a Republican, say, well, my grandpa would go talk to him because he was a Republican and would be friends with those guys. And so if if it went the other way, if two of the three commissioners went Democrat, and those kind of things happened in those days, just as they did in later days, then Mr. Price would go and visit with them. So they always had work. There was always plenty of work, it seemed like, for them. They also framed the funeral home, the Barbara Edwards Arthur Funeral Home, as you all would know it, the Rock Castle, as some people know it, up on East Washington Street. They framed that building for Mr. Rainey, Jack Rainey's dad. Rex Rainey was his name. He built that funeral home. So a lot of projects around. They built the Nation Schoolhouse out in Nation Town, which was out Short Pea Highway, east of Highway C, north of Seymour. I know they built one of those school buildings out there in those days. So, but a lot of barns around the county. Of course, Irene, his dad's mother, was a homemaker, and again, they had a good raising there on that farm, and Grandpa Fred did fairly well. Then in 1953, he sold the farm and came to town and bought what would later become the east part of the Fraker edition, the Fraker Jameson edition, which lays north of Old Route 66, which would be where Price Cutter is now, north of Price Cutter. The old farmhouse was right there by Price Cutter, between it and the Dennis Insurance Agency office there, where it was the American Family Office for many years that the Rebels have. The old farmhouse was right there, and that land laid north of that. Then they also built the new house, which is the insurance office that we just talked about. My grandma and grandpa built that in 1953 or 54, and then sold the other larger house to Claude and Ovia Evans, and they lived there many years until they passed away in the 80s or early 90s. Mrs. Evans, I know, was a cook at the school back in the day when Mom and Dad went to school. So a little bit of history about my grandma and grandpa. Fred then bought the Webster County Tractor and Implement Company, which was located up just north of the Marshfield Mill, right there on Jackson Street. And that's where he worked until he retired in 1968, sold it to McNeely Ford Tractor, and McNeely's moved it back out to the spur out there. Not the spur, I'm sorry, where Postgame Pizza is. McNeely had a John Deere dealership there that he sold back to Implement Company in Springfield, and the building was vacant. And then he bought the Ford Tractor dealership from my grandpa, and they moved it there. Grandpa retired to the farm, and that farm is 2147 Farmland Road, which happens to be the farm that Melanie and I and the boys now have, that we built our new home on 2 years ago. The farm was 132 acres, but it was split after my granddad passed in 1972, and Gene Fraker took the north part. My dad took the south half, 66 acres each. And Andy and Sharon Fraker now have a new home on that north piece. So the farm is still in the family. It has been. I think he actually bought the farm in 1965. And it's been in our family ever since. And we're certainly honored and proud to have that. So after my dad graduated in 1948, well, first of all, while he was in school, as a senior, he laid his eye upon a young lady who was a freshman, Lois Roast. And obviously in those days, she was just a freshman. So they began dating. And the way I understand it, and Barth, you chime in if you have anything to add to this, but the way I understand it, once they started dating, we never heard any stories that they dated anyone else. Again, Mom was a freshman, and he waited for her for 3 years until she graduated. She graduated on May 17th, 1951. They got married on May 18th, 1951. Now, Barth, am I right on all that?
That's my understanding, correct.
Okay. I didn't know if you had anything to add to that or not.
Yeah, I've never heard of them dating anyone else.
Right. Um, while they were dating, well, let's go ahead and talk about Mom's family. So, um, Lois Roast was one of 6 children. Actually, it would have been 7. Uh,
7.
yes, born to Robert Cale, and Josephine Goodnight Roast. Uh, Grandma Josie, she was raised out in the on P Highway, Ebenezer community. James Goodnight and James and Maggie Goodnight. They had the farm that I believe Jeff Galbraith owns out there now on P, just off 38, just south of Ebenezer Church. Cale was raised over in the Teagues community, which wasn't too far away, over on a farm that now I think Tom and Robin Roast have part of that farm. And they've had more of that farm, but I believe they still have the piece that the actual house is on. That Grandpa Sam Roast. Cale was his dad was Sam Roast. His mother was Calla Biggers Roast. She was a Biggers, and he had 5 or 6 brothers and sisters: David Roast, Terrell Roast, Raymond Roast, Ann Hasser Gray, and Aunt Beulah Farr was his 2 sisters. And a lot of their heirs are all still around in the community, in the Marshfield area, or southwest Missouri at least. Cale and Josie were married, I believe, 1928, if I'm not mistaken. They were both born around 1907. They were about the same age. And they lived various places, but when not long after they got married, they lived on where Tom and Robin Roast now live. There was an older home there, and they were building a barn, a log cabin barn, one day, and their firstborn, his name was James Lowell Roast, was 3 years old. Uncle Don Roast, and Leona, of course, who we've had on the show here, my mom's older brother, was 1 year old. And Grandma Josie was pregnant with Mom, Lois. So this would have had to have been around 1932, probably. And anyway, James Lowell, 3-year-old toddler, very active, just as most toddlers are at that age. And he was had migrated out to where the barn was being built by Grandpa Cale and some other folks. And they had went back to the woods to get another load of logs to go on up at the barn, and some of the logs on the barn were not secure, and he climbed up on one side of the barn, and the log not being secure, it rolled back on him, and he fell 8 to 10 feet, and it crushed him, and it killed him. So Grandma was pregnant with Mom. Donald was 1 year old, so she obviously discovers it and has to run a long ways to the neighbors, being pregnant with a 1 year old, carrying a 1 year old, and it was a very tragic day in the family. They got through that because of their faith. They were both obviously very dedicated to the Lord and involved in church, and had been all their lives, as all the Roasts about have ever since as well. And so it carried them through that storm in their life. They went on to have 6 kids then. Don Roast, Lois, mother, June Roast Krieger, Robert Keith Roast, Bobby, Uncle Bob Roast, and then Elvin Leo, Uncle E.L., and then Aunt Phoebe Claire, Phoebe Roast Claire. Those are the 6 kids, sisters and brothers to Mom. They lived on Maple Street then. As the kids were growing up, they all went to school at Marshfield, and they did move to Calico Rock, Arkansas for a short time. Grandpa was in the tie buying business. The war was going on, and railroad ties are extremely important to the war effort. So he was a manager, kind of a regional manager for Potosi Tie Company. And I think if you watched the show last week, Larry Rose talked about the tie industry and how important and vital it was in all the communities. Many communities were centered around buying ties and buying furs and buying various goods that were shipped on trains to the larger metropolitan areas at the time. And certainly ties were one of those. And so the Potosi Tie Company had a yard set up here at Marshfield down along the tracks about where Brooks Gas bulk station is down on Commercial Street. Grandpa worked for him. He became a regional manager, worked his way up, and they asked him to go to Calico Rock, Arkansas, and be for a promotion to have a larger territory to oversee, and they did. And so they allegedly loaded up in the back of an old pickup. They had a tarp over an old pickup rack, and the 6 kids, maybe 5 of them, because I think Phoebe was a young baby or a toddler, but they all sat back there like kids used to do in the back of pickups and headed off to Calico Rock. And we're down there for a few years, not many, maybe 3 or 4 or 5, I'm not sure, but long enough to get established down there, and then decided it was time to come back home. Then they landed on Maple Street. I'm not quite sure, but I believe they first landed in a certain house there, and then later moved into the house that they all ended up graduating from high school from. And the house is still there, and a lot of great memories growing up in those days. I know my dad was courting Mom when she lived there. Now, Barth, can you recall, I wanted to have you chime in here a little bit, some of the stories Mom would talk about walking to school, walking to church. She would go to the United Methodist Church for Sunday school, but they obviously...
Well, it wasn't United. It wasn't United then. It was just the Methodist
Church, right. Yeah, exactly. And but they would go to church at Ebenezer, so she and Aunt June and Uncle Bob, or whichever ones were still home, maybe Uncle Donald, they would walk to Sunday school, and then Grandma and Grandpa would pick them up and take them out to Ebenezer for church, the way I understand it.
Yeah, there's stories there about Mary Ruth Brooks would tell, even when Dad was little, he and Noel Thomas and Mary Ruth would be up in the balcony of the condo building where the Jackson Grill is now. Mm-hmm. And there's that open balcony, and Mary Ruth used to tell a great story that they would get up there and play the piano and sing. And I guess at the time it was seen as being rambunctious. But this was when they were smaller, but that's where they would sneak away to and be up there in the balcony and sing along and play music and laugh. And I had never heard that, because all I could think about was, how do they get the piano up the stairs?
Yeah.
Because it would have been an old upright. But Mary Ruth tells that story. Mom would tell about she and Aunt June walking to the square on Saturday nights. Big deal to go to the square and maybe see a movie at the Ritz and go to the sweet shop or whatever they did. And they would walk back, and they would get across the tracks right by the Dickey house, and they would run because the trees were so big and cracking, and they were always scared. Mm-hmm. And Aunt June tells that story well too, that they were scared by those big trees in the Dickey house.
Yeah.
There must not have been a fence at that point or something, but they were always scared. But Maple Street was very important in their family. When I started working at Cox Hospital, I met a man who said he was related, or he knew my family well and went to school with Mom and Dad. And he said, and he told me who he was, and come to find out it was Sue Ann Lehman's brother. And he said, Charlie Hyde, he said, I'll never forget, on the Saturday night, it was time to be home, and we would be running down Maple, I guess, where they lived. We were late, but he said we would run down Maple and we would hear this glorious sound coming out of the roast home, and said all of the kids and grandkids and the parents, they were all gathered in the front room singing 4-part harmony hymns. Windows were open. He said, I'll never forget that sound going down Maple Street. Yeah. So a lot of things happened in that home right there.
Right. We have some pictures of the centennial, when the centennial occurred in Marshfield in 1955, of much of the family gathered there in that home for pictures. The men had their beards. The women were dressed in their attire for the centennial, and Mom and Dad missed that opportunity because they were in Fort Campbell, Kentucky on June the 12th. Our older brother Mike was born, 1955, and of course the centennial was on July the 4th, so he was only about 3 weeks old, and the doctor in those days did not recommend or allow Mom to come home and make the travel back to Marshfield for the centennial. So that was a little disappointing, but obviously the reason was a very celebratory time for the family. A couple of other quick stories that I thought of before we get out of Mom and Dad's childhood. So there was a couple of things Mom used to talk about, going out to Grandpa and Grandma Goodnight's out by Ebenezer, and there was a little store, obviously, where I guess Rep Logos ran it for a while. It became Joy's Market in later years, but might have been the Pittmans. I'm not sure who ran it back in those days. But one of the little markets down on East Commercial Street down there. They would always get to stop at the store and get ice cream, and that was a big treat to go to Grandma and Grandpa Goodnight's on a Saturday night, because they would come to town to buy their wares, and they would get to stop by there after they'd picked up the girls, June and Mom at the time, and get to go and spend the night with them. They would sleep in the attic with no insulation. In the wintertime, it was extremely cold, but they had feather beds up there, and her and June would stay warm and had great memories, fond memories of those days. Another story that I like to think of that Dad told when they lived on the Fraker farm there that we talked about. His uncle Estrel lived just north of that farm, so they were in that area as well. And Glenn was a teenager. Uncle Glenn was a teenager, and Roy, but they would all help out farming together. They would cut hay, and in those days stack hay, and out in the fields and what have you. And Dad was a boy, and so they would be working over north on Estrel's place, which was half a mile away or something. And they would send Dad to the house to get water, because just to drink, and they'd use a bucket with a ladle or whatever. Well, Dad had a little dog, and I believe her name was Maggie. And so in order to get to the house to get the water, they would have to cross the fence. So he got to the fence, crossed the fence, went and got the water, went back, had to cross the fence again. Of course, he had to set the bucket down. When he set the bucket down, Maggie had to get a drink. And she got her drink. He picked up the bucket. They went on back to the field, and the men all got drinks. Well, Uncle Glenn happened to notice that Maggie got a drink before they did. And he asked Dad about it. Dad was 6 or 7 or whatever. And he looked and said, now Don, did Maggie get a drink out of our water bucket? And he looked at it and he said, well, yes, she did, Uncle Glenn, but she didn't drink very much, just a little bit. And that was always a laugh when we got together and heard those stories in later years. Any other stories, Barth, from their childhood or their younger days before we move into us boys arriving? How about
Well, that's the most important.
Huh?
Go ahead.
How about the Pete and Red's cafe story? You know that one.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I'll have it exactly right, but Mary Ruth Brooks again would tell about going to the cafe after a ball game or something, and Dad was not known to be the most spendy person on certain things, especially when it came to food or something. He noticed prices, and apparently he and Mom would go there on a date, and he would say to Mom, "Now you don't want that hamburger, do you?" Because he was hoping she would back out of wanting the hamburger, so he wouldn't have to pay for it. So I guess they'd split a cherry Coke or something. But Mary Ruth would tell that, and she couldn't stop laughing because she said he was very convincing that she didn't want a hamburger because he didn't want to have to pay for it.
Here's a picture.
Little changed in 80 years.
Yeah. May 18th, 1951. There's the wedding picture from Ebenezer. Very, very attractive couple, and Dad had lots of black curly hair, and it was said that he went to the Army, and when he came out of the Army, he didn't have it anymore. Of course, they gave him a crew cut, and it never grew back as well. So they got married and they started setting up their home, various places I think, but mainly they bought a farm out on Good Hope, off Good Hope Road, right on the Osage River out there. And this was about 1952. They actually lived with Grandma and Grandpa Fraker in the big house out on 38 West, on the second floor with Gene and Bert, who hadn't been married too awful long. They all lived, all four of the kids lived together up there on the second floor. Grandma and Grandpa lived on the first floor for a short time. And then Gene and Bert, I think, went on and moved first, got their place, and then Mom and Dad bought this farm out on Good Hope. And started farming, started putting in crops and what have you. And then Uncle Sam called, which was, I think, 1953. He got his draft papers, and I know he tells a story about he had just put his spring crop in, and he requested. He went to back in those days they had the county draft board. There was a county agent, a veteran representative. I think it was Burley Justice, if that rings a bell. And had to go talk to them about getting not a deferment or anything, just a delay to report until he got his crop in. The crop was coming on, and so anyway, he had to go around to all of the draft board in the county, which somebody in Rogersville, Elkland, Niangua, so forth, and I think they honored that and allowed him to. Of course, the war was over, but Korea was getting underway, and I meant World War II was over is when I said that. Korea was underway as well, though, in '53, and then but Dad lucked out. He did go in then, I think, in the fall, and did not have to go overseas. He stayed stateside. He went to Fort Riley, Kansas, for boot camp, and he was out there during that time with several other Webster County boys. Rex Price was one. Obviously became a lifelong friend. Sigel Birchfield was out there with him in Fort Riley. Richard Erb tells a story about Richard. He was one of the few that had a car, and out of all the boys and what have you. And so Richard would bring guys home, on the weekends when they got passes, and Richard started his time of trading and bartering and making money during those days, because he said he was making money hauling troops GIs back to their homes, to the county and stuff, and had a good time with all those guys. One quick story in those days with Sigel Birchfield. So there was a little dog that they had been out on maneuvers or something, and there was a little dog that was a stray, and Dad had a real soft spot for animals. He, up until the day he passed away, he still did. And so this dog was out there and hungry and so forth. So they bring it back to the barracks, and so Dad, I think's on the lower bunk, and Sigel's above him on the second bunk or something, and they put him under the bunk, and they start, when they would go to mess hall, they'd bring back scraps in their pockets and bring back to feed the dog. Well, before long, there was some old GI from somewhere. I don't know where he was from, but New York or somewhere. He wasn't a Webster County boy, and he started bad mouthing Dad, and I think there was another boy there that was kind of friends to the dog too. About you can't have a dog in here. I'm going to turn you in. Blah blah blah, and so that kind of went on for a while. Finally, Sigel Birchfield had about enough of it. If those of you that knew Sigel, he could pretty much stand on his own and take care of himself. And that old boy was mouthing. He just got off his bunk and went over to that old boy and stood right in front of him and said, "I'm going to tell you something, you son of a gun." That might have not been the exact words he used, but you're not going to touch that dog. And he said, if you're going to have to take that up with Fraker, you're going to have to take it up with me first. And I know Dad always was friends and always respected Sigel, because he did that to help him out with that situation, and I don't think there was a problem with the dog after that. But another one of those stories that you hear growing up that you don't forget. Anything, Barth, that you can think of beyond that?
Time's up.
Oh, you mean for Barth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Time's up.
I guess Barth dropped off. Can you get him back on or not?
I'd have to pay for it.
That's okay. If you can do that, I'll keep talking. I had a little technical issue here with Barth dropping off, but we'll see if we can get him back on. So Fort Riley, Kansas, then they went over to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and that's where he ended up in serving most of his time. Mom obviously went with him, and they'd already obviously, had been married, and that's where Mike was born, in Fort Campbell. Dad ended up being a cook in a big Army hospital. Had a pretty good gig, quite frankly. He cooked special diets for servicemen that were coming back from overseas that had injuries and what have you. Some of them, their mouths might be wired shut or something, so they learned how to prepare special meals for those soldiers. And then he also cooked for the doctors and the surgeons in the hospital, and they wanted special meals. He would have to fix things, that they wanted that were unique. In some cases, weren't like everybody else. So it was kind of a good gig for him. Now they lived not far, as you know. Fort Campbell was not too awful far from Nashville. So during that time, it was a great time for the family. I know Grandma and Grandpa Rose, Grandma and Grandpa Fraker, brothers and sisters, a bunch of them went down and visited from time to time, and they would always go to the Grand Ole Opry, and that was a good time for them. And they would get to see Mike, as a baby, and visit and spend some time on the weekends down there. So they eventually come back to Marshfield, and one other thing, another story. When they would get to come home after Mike got a little bit older, then they would get a weekend pass and drive home. And Mom said that Dad always would have to circle the square. Now, Grandma and Grandpa Fraker lived out where I mentioned, out there where Dennis Insurance Office is. Grandma and Grandpa Rose lived over on Maple Street. But no matter what, they would come into town. Dad would have to circle the square. And one time Mom said, Don, why are you circling the square? Of course, back in those days, that's where the activity was on a Friday night, coming in from where they were coming in from, Nashville or whatever, or Fort Campbell. And he'd say, well, you always have to circle the landing field before you land. And that was what he would always say. And so she got used to it. He would circle the square, see what friends were there, and maybe stop and talk to them before they would get to the grandparents' home. When they came back from the service around 1955, I believe it was the fall of 55, he went to work for International Harvester, which was down on actually where Cecil's engine service was. Those of you that know where Cecil's was. And Ernie Vestal, I believe, was an owner, and he made Dad a partner. He bought into the business. And those were the days where they were selling International refrigerators, International pickups, farm equipment, pretty thriving business in the late 50s. He said we used to take those old ice boxes in on trade on a new refrigerator and bring them back to the shop, and we would chop the boxes up for firewood and burn them in our stove in the shop. Said hundreds of them. And the money that those later brought, as you know, the old ice boxes, who would have ever guessed? He did that until about 1958, and then he got on with Kraft Foods. This was a really good career move for Dad. Kraft was a thriving company then. They had been buying up other milk producers or milk collection companies. In Marshfield, they had a company called the Sugar Creek Creamery, which was part of the Producers Exchange system. So it was located right down in front of the MFA, where the MFA feed store is today. There was a building there. Producers Creamery is what I guess MFA bought out Sugar Creek, and then Kraft bought out Producers Creamery, and then in a couple of years later after that, they built the new building over on the east side of town there that would later become Hampton's, the beginning of Hampton's store. That was the Kraft receiving station that was built somewhere in the mid 60s. But he worked out of the old building, actually worked out of Springfield, the Kraft facility up there for a while. And I think Mom and Dad actually moved to Springfield for a short time around 1959, about 1960. I was born in 59, and I think in 60 they moved up there for a short time. I had my first birthday party there. We've got pictures of that at that house on South Lone Pine. And then moved back to Marshfield, and he bought the farm that joined my grandma and grandpa, which became the west part of the Fraker addition, where the Nazarene Church is now. All of those streets in there, Ash Drive and Scenic Drive and so forth. That's all part of that farm. And that was again around 1960 or 1 or something like that. They lived in the old big house there on the corner where John Calloway's widow lives. That's the home that they lived in. And then short time after that, they built 5 new homes in their married life. Their first one was over on Bedford Street, and then they built another one on Bedford, just right down from it, Locust and Bedford. And then those were both built there in the early 60s. And then they moved to Lebanon in about 62 as Kraft was continuing to grow, and they wanted one of the field service. He was a field service agent. He called on the dairy farmers. And you back with me, Barth? Barth? Okay.
I'm here.
Okay,
I'm
great.
here.
I'm just making sure you're back with me. So we've kind of moved into Mom and Dad's early married life. Well, went to Bedford Street houses, the 2 houses, and then moved to Lebanon for 3 years and lived on Stanwood Street and then out on East 32. On Stanwood Street, we were neighbors across the street to Don Weaver. Don, who became good friends with Mary Ruth Brooks in later years. His family, he had a couple boys, and they lived across the street. He had Don's office machines in Lebanon. Dad got involved in the Lebanon community, became a member of the JCs. It's kind of funny, ironic. He was in the JCs with both Bob Plaster, who owned Empire Gas, and then also Melanie, my wife's grandfather. Delmer Hilton ran the radio station in Lebanon. And so Mom and Dad got to know Delmer and his wife, and Melanie's dad, and all of her uncles were young men in those days. So sometimes things like that, circle back around. Was down there until 65. I went to kindergarten there. Of course, Mike was he went his first 4 elementary grades in Lebanon, Maple Crest School. And then we moved back to Marshfield and built a new home over on Ash Drive in the Fraker addition in 1965. Dad was still with Kraft, but they allowed him to transfer back to Marshfield and work his service territory out of the Marshfield facility. Started first grade then in Marshfield in the fall of 1965. And then 2 years later, the monumental event in the history of our family, Barth Fraker was born.
Well, yeah, that's when things started getting good.
That's why we brought you back on here when you said you dropped off.
Yeah.
I do have to tell the night he was born, though. I do have a little story for that. So I'm 8 years old. Mike's 12. So we wake up, or Mike may have already been awake, but I wake up and I come walking into the family room, and there's Grandma Fraker sitting in there watching TV. And, well, good morning. Well, good morning. What's going on? Well, you've got a little brother. Really? Yeah. His name is Barth. He was born this morning real early. Okay. Well, Granny, what are we having for breakfast? Anyway, that was my comment. But it was okay. It was okay. You remember anything about that, Barth?
I don't, but little has changed in 40 years.
Let's change it. July the 25th, 1967. That was the date of that particular event. So, Dad, about that time, actually, right about that time, he made a job change. He went to work for the Citizen State Bank in Marshfield. Mom was a homemaker. Uh, Times were pretty good. Three boys, 60s. Dad gets a job at the bank. Dad builds us a ball field over in the Fraker dish, and he keeps a couple of the building lots. He had been selling building lots off this farm, and he just subdivided it and cut in the streets and all. Kept a couple of lots and built a ball field. So we had lots of neighborhood boys and gals that would come and play ball. The Vestal boys, Gene and Greg. Tom and Barbara lived just a couple of streets over, and Tom worked with Dad at craft. El and Dolores, uncle and aunt, Craig, their son, Carrie, their daughter, lived right across the street. Dad sold them a lot. And they, Steve Murphy was neighbors there and played ball with us. Dennis Beck would ride his bike up from the Spur Drive, of course, or not Spur Drive, West Washington Street. The Hyde boys lived right there on Blair Street, north of Bob Baldwin's service station, and they would play just a great time. Rick Cole lived around the corner over there and had a lot of fun with Rick. We rode bikes and go-karts and soapbox derbies. Just had a great time growing up in those days. Barth was still pretty small. He'd go over to Granny Fraker's, and she taught him to play the piano. You want to add anything to that story, Barth?
Well, I'm just thinking, Mom went back to work at some point. I know you're going to get there, but
Yeah.
we're running out of time. They built another home on Elm Street, but Mom went to work at the assessor's office,
Mhm.
and so I spent a lot of time at Grandma's. I was there every summer because I would ride with Dad to his work at the bank and another bank, and I would walk across the street to Grandma Fraker's. So I was at her home. I just have lots of memories being there, and came along so late in life. Everybody else had gone on. I was kind of like her child in a way because I was there all the time.
Well, Grandpa died in '72, and you were 5, and she would call over to the house. She was lonely, obviously, and you were really a godsend for her. But she would call Mom and say, "Can Barth come over?" And sure, and you enjoyed it, and she spoiled us, obviously, and it was a good arrangement. And then but she had time to teach you how to play the piano too.
That's right.
You were certainly a great thing for her in those days because it was tragic that she lost her husband of 50 some years.
Well, and we would be known on an afternoon she'd set me on her lap, and I got to help her drive to the Dairy Princess and get crinkle cut French fries.
Yes, yeah, or the big wig.
Yeah.
Um, so Dad had the farm. Grandpa passed away in '72, and we had moved then, built a new home on Elm Street, the split level home that the Theobalds now have. That was the one they built there. I think that was their fourth new home that they had built, and then in '75 built the home that they ended up, retiring in and living until their last days, which was just next door. But again, same scenario on that side of town. For me, Eric Hall was down the street on Bedford. The Thomas boys, Joe Brooks, Rusty Lewis, just even Susan Newcomb and Christy Lewis. We all played ball together over on in the schoolyard behind the school there on Hubble School, and just a great time growing up there. And Grandma Rose lived right across the street from the Thomas boys, so a lot of activity over there in that area. Sharon Meyer lived on Bedford. Randy Bumgarner, his sister lived there. And of course, Sharon was a built-in babysitter for Barth, who, the right age to watch him some. And but you think back about Eric Hall and I are very good friends still today. And by the way, his father Bill just passed away, and we talk often about those days and how blessed we were, and it couldn't have been any better. It couldn't have been a better childhood. And I've said that 1,000 times. Couldn't have been two better families to be born into than Mom and Dad's family both, and the closeness that we've always had, and the respect that we've had for one another. It's remarkable. It's almost unheard of in today's times. We have what, Barth? We have 17 first cousins on Mom's side, and I guess only two on. Well, there's 5 of us on Dad's side, but Andy and Gina Robinson, Andy Fraker, and then the 3 of us boys. But on the Rose side, there's 17, and we all, everybody.
Well, do we count Andy? Do we count Andy?
Well, on his good days, yeah. On his good
Okay.
days. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But and the extended family the same way. Lots of great people, and the majority of them all still live here in the Marshfield or Webster County area, which again is very remarkable that we have that. And I don't know how you could be more blessed than that. So
Well, we were, and it was just a different time. I mean, I think of the things that pulled people together. Small town, but just integrity mattered, and doing things on a handshake, and that meant more to our folks than a lot of other things. I used to ask the question, how come we don't go to the lake on the weekends like these other people? And Dad's response was, well, we're church people. We stay home on the weekends, because we were going to be in church on Sunday morning. There wasn't any question.
yeah, that's right. And the gospel music was important, very, very important. Dad, I've heard people say, Dad had an instrument in his throat, and he really did. He had a gift for song that he just had a gift, and you have a gift to play the piano, and you can sing well as well. But Dad, just for natural ability, he really did had a beautiful voice, and he was able to share that with people as early as I think 14 years old when he was in high school. In choir, I think I've heard him say that, Mr. Mooney or the other gentleman, there was another music guy too, came to him one day and said, I need somebody to sing at a funeral. And
Yes,
it was decided that Dad would be the one. I don't know how they decided it. And Martha Bledsoe, who became Martha Marlin, who's Keith Marlin's mother, played the piano for him, and she was in the choir as well. And if you look, I was just looking this morning at the annuals, the yearbooks annuals here, and it shows those pictures of them in choir, and they went to state one time. He and her both were in a mixed quartet or double mixed quartet or something, and they won first at the state. And so he was gifted with that. Mom was gifted with a beautiful voice as well, and then her whole family, all of her, her mom and her dad and Uncle Donald and family members, her granddad Sam Rose, they all sang gospel music at church, and were known for that or whatever. So pretty amazing.
well, they were taught harmony too. I think we sometimes don't hear that as often now, but they were just taught to harmonize. Just automatic. They didn't have to even read the notes. They just knew
By ear.
when the song would start. By ear, they would just go to harmony.
Yeah. We're kind of up to the 70s and moving into the new home in 75. And then I graduated in 77 from high school. Mike graduated in 73. And you then graduated in 85. So you were there a little bit longer than we were around. And I think Dad, enjoyed the farm after Grandpa died. He spent a lot of time out there. He built a big pond when he retired in 1991. Mom was still working at the courthouse and enjoyed that. Worked with some great people up there. I think her first employer was Lloyd Clift, and Lloyd was good to her. She enjoyed Lloyd. He was a good person. And then Johnny Phipps was elected assessor. And then I guess Jim Jones. I guess just the three, wasn't it, Barth?
Yeah, she got to stay through 3 assessors, which often wouldn't happen if the office holder would change. They wouldn't necessarily keep the office staff. But she was there for 20 years, I guess.
Yeah, and worked side by side with Toady Clare, and who'd actually, they were both in the same class in school, 1951, and then they worked together. I guess that whole time, and became very good friends.
I'll meet somebody today that'll say, I worked with your mom in the courthouse, and they always talk about the sour cream twists and the cinnamon rolls. And we laugh about, now there's a hot thing going on with the Stanley thermos. Everybody has the Stanley thermos. And Mom was carrying a Stanley thermos in the 70s, and I guess it's made its way back now.
Yeah, she had the
full of coffee, I guess.
The old green and silver.
The courthouse, I guess, couldn't afford a coffee maker, so she had to bring coffee from home every morning to eat with their homemade cinnamon roll.
And we didn't talk about Grandma Josie much, but of course, she learned all of that from Josie Roast, and Aunt Phoebe and Aunt June and Mom. All were blessed with that ability to be able to make and bake and cook, to where everything they made and touched was delicious.
One really good funny funny story I can't let go is Mom and Aunt June would tell Grandma Josie would make pies, and there was enough of them they had to make 2 pies to feed that evening. And Grandma had made 2 chocolate pies, and they were on the stove, and Mom and Aunt June would go through and they'd stick their finger in and get a little taste, and they would go on through, and it made Grandma mad. And when Grandpa got home that night, I don't know the exact details, but he said, well, if you wanted that pie so bad, you're both going to sit down there and eat the whole pie. And they did. And Mom and June would just laugh about how they got so sick from eating that whole pie, because they never did it again. The other thing that I have to tell about Mom is how many times did she make a pastry or a pie, and it might be just a little bit brown on the bottom. It would look just like what most people would take, but Mom says, oh, that's a little brown on the bottom. I'm just going to leave that for you all. I'm going to make another one. And so we were the benefactor of many, many pies and cakes that were better than most people would even show up with.
Or if the pie crust, if it wasn't perfect, we got to eat the one that wasn't perfect, which is great.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. I have a picture here of Mike and I. Whoop, wrong one. I'm backwards. Mike and I with Mom, we're on an old donkey here that my granddad had, Fred had, over at the back of his backyard. There's Mom and Mike, and then I'm the young toddler there in front. But she was a remarkable woman, definitely. And then I got one of Dad on his tractor in later years. Many of you remember this picture. 4th of July, pulling the veterans on his old Alice Chowner. And then another picture that's worthy of showing. Mom and Dad, Grandpa Cale, Uncle Bill Farr singing down at the fairgrounds. They used to have gospel sings down there. Even during the fair, one night of the fair, they would have gospel sings. I can't tell you if this was a fair picture or just an event, but all 4 of them singing around the microphone.
Yeah, that picture also, if you look really closely in the background, you'll see Gary Fraker, real small. You will see Hiram Hoover, I guess, who might have been, was he mayor or something? Then you'll see the Schaefer sisters.
Oh yeah,
on the top row.
yeah. Um, yeah, this would have been in the late '50s, so uh, based on Dad's hairline, because he still had a little bit of hair. Now, this was a picture taken about 1970, probably. We all took family pictures about 1970. I think the retirement years, about 91, Dad retired, Mom retired, 2 or 3 years after that. They did get an opportunity to do a little bit of traveling. They never did a whole lot. We would take vacations. As kids, we might go to a St. Louis Cardinal game or a Kansas City game. We went to Texas and visited a cousin down there. Mom had a cousin, David Fullington, that lived in San Antonio. We went down there one summer. But we didn't do a lot of traveling, but they did get to do some traveling. And well, I think you got to do a little bit with them after Mike and I left the house too, if I'm
We
not
did. We went
mistaken.
on one trip to the Smokies with Grandma and Grandpa roast. And then you all got it. You guys kind of got the good end of the stick there. The only place we went was Springdale, Arkansas for the Albert Brumley Gospel singing every year in August.
Yeah.
And then one year, Dad convinced me that we were going on this big vacation and we were going to go to Oklahoma because I was always wanting to go someplace. And we went to, I think it was called Mound City. Would that be right? Or Grove, Oklahoma,
Oh,
somewhere
Grove,
in
to the
there.
old town. Is that the
We
one you're
went to
talking
the
about?
old town, and yes, and we went to a place
What?
that he got what we know now as a timeshare, and you take the little tour on the golf cart, and you get your name in a drawing, and he won a watch. We
Oh,
didn't win anything big, but he won a watch, and I think we were home maybe a day and a half later. But
yeah.
they convinced me this was going to be a big vacation.
It was a vacation, right?
It was someplace besides home. Yeah,
That's right. After after you graduated then, and then that's when after that they retired. Then they got to take some trips with Kirby and Gene Jonas.
they
They
did.
they
Kirby would walk in the bank. Yeah,
mhm.
Kirby would say, "We're going on this trip," and they would. Dad was
Yeah,
not inclined to go places, but he just said, "We're going. Be ready on this day, and we'll be back eventually."
yeah,
And
yeah,
somehow he did it. I'm surprised he got him to do it.
yeah. Well, by that time they were retiring and kind of realizing they needed to do it, I guess. But they'd spend all their time driving. It seemed like they would
Yes,
drive to get to the hotel or wherever they were going, and the sights they saw were in the car driving by. But had a good time and with Kirby and Gene and enjoyed those trips for sure. Um, of course, I don't know uh, about when it happened. Mom, they were obviously in their 60s when they retired, and then they did have some good years there, and then Mom developed the initially dementia and eventually Alzheimer's. I don't know, Barth. Would you say she was in her early 70s when it started, sort of? Um,
I'd say yeah, early to mid. Yes,
yeah, and then she passed away at 78 years old, in 2011. Um,
she really only had about 3 years that it was really,
yeah,
or maybe 4 years that it
yeah,
was noticeable, and she'd had those back-to-back surgeries within 6 months, and I think that was kind of
yeah.
the ice storm. The ice storm was when I remember things
Hmm.
started kind of kicking in.
Hmm. And we were fortunate that she didn't have to go to a rest home facility. Dad he stepped up and did a good
Yes.
job, a really good job of taking care of her. We'd always kind of said she had kind of taken care of him all of his life, and he ended up, being the one to take care of her, which sometimes that's the way things work out. But he did a great job, and uh, we're forever thankful for that. Uh, and the other thing I've always said too is her Alzheimer's. It affects different people different ways, and I think hers was better than many, in the way it affected him. I mean, it certainly made her life challenging, but she didn't. She still pretty well knew us, at least us, the immediate family, right up the last until the last few months. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that was
Even the last 30 days.
yeah.
Yes.
She attended my inauguration at the Capitol in January of 2011, and she passed March 30. So that was, she did well enough to be able to come to that. So we were blessed in that regard. She was just cheated out of some life. I think she should have had another 10 years or so. But and then of course, Dad, he did real well, extremely well on his own for several years, and then you stepped up and came in and helped with him in the later years, and you were a blessing too, and we appreciate that very much. Again, didn't go to the nursing home. Pretty remarkable that we didn't either one have to do that. But I guess in general, to look back, they had a wonderful life, nearly 60 years together, and um, they both had wonderful childhoods. He had a great career. She had a good job. I mean, they had that typical 50s, 60s sort of patriarchal arrangement, like the world was in those days, at least in the rural Ozarks. But all in all, a good life together, and I think we're very blessed to be their children. Anything
Yeah.
else?
Dad was a
Yeah.
connect.
Mhm.
Dad really liked to connect people, and I see that kind of in all of us, or at least I know I do. He like if someone was say, "Oh, I'm from New York," he'd probably ask them, "Oh, do you know so and so?" Just because I mean, there's millions of people, but he
Yeah,
he liked to connect
he
people, and he
did.
just assumed, and had a lot of funny stories. Just and loved to laugh, especially earlier when I was younger. I remember him wanting to laugh, and I was on a trip to New York one time with a bunch of students I took. And I called him from the top of the Empire State Building. He said, "Well, son, you sound like you're next door."
Yeah,
I mean, he loves to just, that's just what he thought. Well, how can you be on top of that building calling me? You sound like you're living next door.
right.
And just sometimes the simplicity was where the funny was, and but I can tell you the things that would get his gizzard was you stand for the flag. Veterans meant a lot to him. That's why he pulled those veterans in the parade all those years. But it just really got him that someone wouldn't stand for the flag when it went by.
Yeah,
And that was a very meaningful thing for him. He didn't much care for people that dodged the draft either back in the day, but he certainly wanted people to respect the flag,
yeah,
and that meant a whole lot to him.
it did. Um,
Can't
mom,
blame him.
mom was the best mother, the best anybody could be. Nobody could be any better, and I'm sure many would say that about their mother, and they should. But for us, um, there was just nobody that could have been any better. She was the best,
Right.
and
Yep.
she wanted the best for everyone. She struggled to say anything negative about anyone. Now, she might have thought it a time or two, but boy, she kept it to herself because she was taught and taught us if you can't say something good about someone, keep your mouth shut. Um,
I can
those,
name on one hand the times that I heard her say something about someone that wasn't positive,
mhm.
and I'll never forget it. I haven't done so well in that department.
Yeah, me neither. Um, the little things that she taught us specifically, Dad did too, but hers were a little more um, impactful at an early age. Like, well, if you have to think about whether you ought to go with that person or do that or not, maybe you shouldn't. That's one I remember.
Right.
Um,
I
just
remember driving down by the post office one day, and I was telling her about being teased at school. Someone was laughing at me for something. I wasn't the most athletic, as we all know. And I was right in front of the post office in her car, and she said, "Well, just laugh along with them. If they're laughing at you, just laugh along with them."
mhm.
And I still remember her telling me that and where I was. specifically.
Mhm.
Well, just laugh along with them. Don't let it get to you.
Yeah. Yeah, all those little things you learn before you're in kindergarten that you read about today, that was the way of life for us. I mean, yeah, that's exactly, how we were raised, were living by those kinds of things. And I mentioned this at Dad's funeral too. He was proud, he was particular, he wanted things his way, and that meant straight and plumb and his way. And but so many today, and I'm not near as particular as he is, but so many today could care less about some of that stuff. Just do it if it feels good, or just do this or do that because you want to. But he tried to do things because it was the right thing to do, and wasn't perfect, but if he wanted to build a birdhouse, it was going to be a perfect birdhouse. You know,
Yep.
if he wanted the fascia on the porch fixed, it was going to be perfect. And that we've lost a lot of that in our society today too. Anything else?
Well, just another funny, because
Yep.
he is so funny. You look back on things and remember the funny stuff. But I remember one mom did all those pies and all those pastries for people all over the county for all those years in this little tiny space of this kitchen. And I get tickled when I walk into some of these people's homes that are just glorious big kitchens. And I always think, boy, what mom could have done with that. But then I remember she had a hand mixer, which she used every day. And her hand mixer, she was ready for a new one. Something gave out on it. And Dad was all proud of himself. He went to Walmart, bought her a new hand mixer, and he says, "Son, I got her a new hand mixer." He said, "It's the best one I could find. It's just the greatest thing. She's gonna love it." And I think, come to find out, it was like $7, but it was a hand mixer that he was proud of because he went and did it on his own.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah.
I think she had that till the end.
Everything he did, it would be the best. I mean, he wanted to make sure it was the best. Might
That's
not have
right.
been the best,
Yeah,
but to him it was,
it might not
because
have
he
been the
did it.
best, but to
Yeah.
him it was the best
Of course,
because
she
he did
used
it and it was affordable.
absolutely. She used that old Sunbeam mixer for 30 years. Remember,
Oh yeah.
Sunbeam
Oh
white,
yes.
the with the that you raise it up and lower it, and yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
we didn't mention the Samad Club. Um,
Yeah. Mom was a member of a group of ladies that the word Samad stands for dames, Dames. I think they used to be household economic groups back in the day, and they made them change the name for some reason. But dear friends out of that group, and Sue Ann Lehman and Frida Gentry and Barbara Heron and Jean Thomas and Neva Schroeder, and I mean the list goes on and on. Kfar and Ivina Farr, I can't say them all. Dear friends, and I do remember them one time telling me, Frida, I think Frida Gentry said, "Your mom told us tonight that she's having some memory problems." And she told me that mom had told her that after the doctor had told her that sometime in the, you know, near the last 5 or 6 years. But I always thought it was great because my two of my teachers were in that group, and I just thought that was cool because I'd come home some night and they'd be sitting in our living room having coffee and homemade pie, and that was my teacher. I loved that there was that connection. But good people.
thinking about the social aspect of their life, the families that we used to gather going all the way back to when we were kids, the Vestals, as you mentioned, Barbara and Tom Vestal, and
Barbara.
and of course, a lot of family, Gene and Bert, Noel and Gene Thomas. They all would play cards. Jackie and Bill Hall, Eric's folks, just lots of people. Bill Laverty, later years, Bill and Molly were friends. They would visit. Mom and Dad took Dean and Sue Cancer to gospel singings in later years. Just they did a lot of things with people back in those days. Glenn and Phyllis Fraker, Uncle Glenn, Aunt Phyllis, spent many hours at our house. A lot of times it was late at night after they had been to another meeting, and they would stop by and catch up, and Mom would have a refreshment and just visited, and that's what people did in those days, and they enjoyed that. They both enjoyed it.
A lot of people thought that Mom and Aunt Alberta Fraker was sisters
Mhm,
because they were together so often.
mhm.
You could be guaranteed that either Mom and Aunt Bert, or Mom and Aunt Dolores, or Mom and Aunt June, or Mom and they were going to go shopping somewhere.
Mhm.
But Mom and Aunt Bert especially would go shopping, and Dad would just laugh about, well, she won't be home till after 10 o'clock when the last store closes,
Mhm.
and he was pretty well
He was
right.
okay with that. Yeah, he's okay with
Oh
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because you know why? She'd bring us home a McDonald's hamburger. We didn't have McDonald's in Marshfield then.
Or stop at Consumers Market and get those big
Or
maple
stop at
iced
Consumers Market.
cinnamon
Yep,
rolls. I
yep.
love those in those days.
Or Mr. Donut. Or yeah, yeah. That's right. We could predict it.
But I was thinking about this when they were talking about making the sour cream twists for the cherry festival. And the sour cream twists are wonderful, and they're kind of her, you know,
Something
her
funny about that.
benchmark. Yeah, what's that?
It is those were Mom. I mean, Mom
Yeah,
got that recipe
yeah,
from a lady in Lebanon,
yeah.
and Mom brought that. I can't. And I've tried to find that lady's name, but a lady in Lebanon gave that recipe to her, and that was her thing. Was
Hmm.
those sweet sour cream twists. Of course, other people picked it up, and
Yeah,
they've changed it a little bit here and there. But now our niece Annie has mastered them.
yeah.
They are exactly like Mom's, and they don't get too brown on the bottom. If they do, you leave those there for the kids, and you make another batch.
And June and Phoebe could make them as well. I mean, they could do it
Oh
too.
yes,
They had that.
yes,
They all three had that
yeah,
knack that Grandma Josie taught them. This will match this much dash here and this much pinch there, and they could just do that
yep.
without. But what I was getting ready to say is, even out of all the coconut cream pies, the cakes, I mean, all of those, I still think what I miss the very most, because nobody else can make it like she did, is that white, sort of white, creamy white sponge cake with the chocolate sauce.
Oh yeah, that's in in the Ebenezer cookbook under Mama's plain cake,
That
and there's a chocolate sauce, and that she knew that was your favorite cake, and that hot, well, they call it chocolate gravy,
it
kind
had
of.
it had to be hot
Um,
or it had to be cold.
had
It
to be
couldn't be
hot.
warm. Yeah, I could eat
Yep,
it cold too, but it couldn't be warm. It had to be hot or cold. But
yep.
that's what I would want if I for birthday if I had my choice. Man,
Mama's plain cake,
yeah,
and
it
she'd
wasn't.
say she'd always say, "Well, I got to make Lyndall that cake." And she said, "I said, well, what cake?" She'd say, "Oh, that just that old plain one."
Hmm. And it wasn't a pound cake. It was more fluffy than a pound cake, but it wasn't as fluffy as a fluffy cake. It was in between. I guess it was like a sponge cake or something. I don't know, but yeah, that was my favorite, I think. And the sauce
Yeah.
too. She knew how to make the sauce to where it wasn't too chocolatey, but it was chocolatey enough.
Yep.
Anyway, well,
I'd
this has
take one
been
right now.
yeah, me too. This has been awesome, and I really appreciate those that are viewing this or will, that you've allowed us this time, Barth and I, to reminisce and to document the history of our parents, because out of all the people that we're having on, it's been great. I've learned so much, and it's been fun, and we're going to keep doing it. But I wanted to take one time, one day, and just document and record some of the things that we experienced growing up, so our grandkids and kids and grandkids and great grandkids can understand a little bit more about their grandparents. And you know, we they lived a great life, nearly 60 years together, and then they're gone, and all we have is a few things that were theirs and the memories. And this is a way for us to keep those memories alive and to keep them, a little piece of them, alive. And so it means a lot to us, and we appreciate everyone understanding and listening and watching. And hopefully we can do this for some of your families. I'd be honored to lead a discussion or have an interview with anyone that would like to share stories of those that have already went on before us in this format. So I would invite anybody to holler at me if you'd like to do that. But Next week,
Are we out of time?
hey, no, YouTube doesn't charge us anymore. If you want to do something else,
Well,
so,
the only thing I think
uh-huh.
that we've missed,
Yeah,
that we've not really
yeah,
said,
yeah,
is the piece about their faith. Their
yeah,
faith has been
yeah,
monumental in everything. I mean, we talked
absolutely,
about church, we talked about
yeah,
singing, but the thread of faith that went through everything
hmm,
um, was first and foremost. And I think in a heritage way, we don't learn of salvation or anything because of our necessarily. You aren't born into all of a sudden, you're just automatically this because that's how you were born. It's something that you decide to do on your own. But the stage was set for each one of
yeah.
us
You have to learn about
to
it.
make a decision for our to learn about it, to make our future. And I often think about when I turn on the news and I can just visualize, mom and dad watching the news and talking about how bad things are in the world and that sort of thing. Just the reality of life. We all feel it watching the news sometimes. And but somehow it was all okay, because especially mom would say, but it's all okay
Yeah,
because we know who hold what is I don't know about tomorrow, but we know who holds tomorrow. And
yeah,
and that thread of faith, it has been passed down for others to make that decision. And frankly, there's times in the last few years I've said, "Boy, I'm sure glad my mom and dad aren't around to see this."
yeah.
I think that about the state of our country and things, and not to be preachy, but I do. I think that what they would think about, the church and just different things, and I'm just glad they haven't had to experience some of that dissension that goes on, and just thankful for that faith and that heritage that's passed down to really know what's important.
Perfect, Barth. Well said. I'm glad you mentioned that. We did touch on church, but not. Yeah, it was foremost, first and foremost in their lives, and very important. They rarely missed a Sunday in church, rarely, and of course the majority of those Sundays, especially in their later years, well, was they were in the choir, which is a way of serving, in a way that not everyone can do in that capacity. So, and they did, and they enjoyed it, and they enjoyed Wednesday night rehearsals and the fellowship and the friendships and the camaraderie they had with the other choir members. That was a big, big part of their life. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I tried to get everything jotted down, and I really didn't catch that one as well as I should have. But uh, that's at the top of the list, no question about that.
Well, it's just another example of the little brother taking care of things.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's well, and I am getting older and forgetful, so you'll have to give me that. So.
All right.
Next Saturday, I am not going to be here. Melanie and I are going to be gone. The following Saturday, though, we do have guests already lined up. I don't want to say it too early, because I've found that we have more interest if we wait to say. Plus, there could be a change of plans, and we don't want to, get people's hopes up. But we will have a pair of guests on here 2 weeks from today that I think everyone will really enjoy, and we'll bring back some great memories of Marshfield. So try to tune in. We appreciate those that do. We're continuing to grow, and we're not doing this for any other reason than to document history. I don't make a penny on this. Matter of fact, the time I spend, I could be working at the farm or something, but I enjoy it. It's my way of helping to contribute to the future of those that enjoy history and want to know more about the days gone by. So, Barth, thanks for
But
joining
now
me. Uh-huh.
you probably wouldn't turn down a good cake with chocolate sauce, would you?
No, I would not.
Okay.
And it wouldn't have
Maybe
to
Pat
even,
Abbott's listening or
it would
something,
it
and Pat
wouldn't
might be able to.
it wouldn't even have to be Mom's, but yes, that would be
Yeah.
awesome. But I don't want to put
Maybe
anybody
the
out.
Abbott girls can make some apple dumplings or something for you. Yeah.
Well, they're probably pretty tired from the Cherry Festival, I would imagine.
They probably are.
Yeah.
They probably are.
Okay, we'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining us. We went over today, but that's okay, because it's my show and I'm sticking to it. See ya. Thanks.